This B Podcast Network show is presented by IXL. IXL's all-inclusive online teaching and learning platform simplifies edtech needs and accelerates achievement in 95 of the top 100 U.S. school districts. IXL delivers personalized learning across a comprehensive pre-K to 12 curriculum, including math, language arts, science, and social studies, and it helps you assess student performance through actionable real-time insights at every level of your school or district. This one solution performs work that typically requires dozens of different tools. Want to find out why so many leading districts trust IXL? Visit ixl.com/BE. That's ixl.com/BE. We're proud to be sponsored by MyFlex Learning. MyFlex Learning is a scheduling platform that helps middle and high schools meet the individual needs of all students. Schools can easily create and manage time for flex blocks, win time, activity periods, RTI, counselor and teacher appointments, and much more. And with its built-in accountability tool and reporting features, MyFlex Learning solves your challenges around getting kids where they need to be and understanding how flex time is spent. Make your flex time work for you. Visit myflexlearning.com/BE to learn more and receive $500 off the first year. That's myflexlearning.com/BE. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in to our episode today of the Authority Podcast on the B Podcast Network. I'm Ross Romano, and I'm excited to welcome today's guest, Dr. Carey Borkoski, who's going to speak with me about a book that's going to give us all a lot to reflect on, I think. And Carey's an associate professor and research fellow in the School of Education at Loyola University in Maryland. She's also a lead coach in the Hopkins University School of Education, and her book is Dancing with Discomfort, a framework for noticing, naming, and navigating our in-between moments. And the book is available from John Catt Educational. Carey, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, happy to be here, Ross. Great to chat with you.
So let's just go right here to start, because I think, this book clearly is, this isn't my assumption. It's not just an idea that occurred to you one day. I think the ideas in here are a culmination of a lot of life experience and professional experience. So I would love for you to tell me, what really inspired you eventually to end up writing this book, and why now, right? Like when you got to a certain point where you said, you know what, now's the time where this book, really needs to be written.
Yes, such a good question. And I mean, I'll say right off the bat, I think writing a book for me was one of those bucket lists, right? So I sort of had it in my mind. I didn't know when, I didn't know how, but it was something I wanted to do. So I'll say that first. And then I think, look, as you get older, you spend more time in your profession and you feel like you've built up some efficacy and some experience. I started to recognize that, a lot of my sort of bumps and bruises along the way were really the sort of jewels, if you will, of learning. And I was reflecting a lot on that for me personally. And then of course, as an educator, and really this isn't exclusive to educators, anyone who's working with someone as they develop and grow into something, you notice that the moments that are most beneficial are often those moments of what some researchers call productive struggle, right? It's,
Mhm.
that discomfort, the nervousness, and our ability. It's not really the sort of what you come with in terms of skills and expertise and all the knowledge. It's really, and I know we've heard this before, it's how you show up and react in a moment. Like, what's your
Right.
next action? And so I think, the collective, my own personal journey as both a student and just a person growing up, becoming a parent and being an educator now of doctoral students. And we can talk more about the uniqueness of the practitioner doctorate that I was teaching in. It just felt like I had a lot to say, Ross.
Mhm.
And I just, I made some connections. We were talking about networking before we hit the recording. And some of it was luck, some of it was timing, and some of it was my own persistence that, led me to start writing the book.
Yeah, and I mean, from a reader's perspective, and thinking about where an individual may be in their professional journey
Mm.
or even their personal experiences. Is there a time when you say, this is, if you're going through this right now, this is the most important time to pick up this book, right? And then I know you write a section about how to use the book and
Hmm.
kind of guiding the readers on, okay, here's how to make the best use of this. And it really is the type of content that people can read at any time and internalize the ideas and apply them. But also, we
Hmm.
all know there's also certain times where it's really critical to say, I don't have any answers right now, I need something. All right,
Yeah.
here's what we have for you.
Yeah, yeah. So I think it's so interesting that we're talking now, Ross, because it's been about a year since the book,
Mhm,
was released. And so of course, I always come to the table as a learner and I'm really learning a lot about sort of the role of the book. And so I think a year ago I would have said to you, the obvious response to that is anytime anyone's experiencing what you would perceive as a transition, right? Whether it's
mhm.
starting school. I mean, it's kind of apropos that we're getting close to the first days of school, right? Going back to school, whether you're the student, the teacher, the professor, if you're changing jobs, if you're in between jobs. I think this book can be supportive, can be scaffolding, can be sort of ideas for creating potentially new habits, so that you can manage these things. I would say, though, a year out, I would probably amend that response to say, I would pick up the book before one of those sort of seminal moments happen, because what I learned, and really what I was hoping to message in the book, is that we need to practice this work. And I talk about sort of practice versus performance. And what I kind of mean by that is don't wait till that like big job change or big shift to work on these things. Like practice in a more comfortable, familiar setting so that you can start to, work out some of the kinks and iterate and redevelop. So I really do think it's anyone who's interested in figuring out strategies to be more present even in their day to day, not just in the transition moments.
Yeah, and you do write about, how this is something that can be practiced, right? Or you get more repetitions over time.
Hmm.
What are some of the scenarios there? So one, when you talk about practicing, is it the type of thing where you may want to create situations in which
Mm.
you need to practice these skills?
Hmm.
Are there really kind of smaller moments that are happening to us daily that we're just not necessarily recognizing as opportunities to work through these
Hmm.
skills? How would you kind of set the context for when are good opportunities to kind of practice this, so then when there's a big situation going
Yeah.
on, right, we have a little bit of skill development under our belts.
Yeah. Another really good question. I mean, I think there are multiple responses to that. I mean, I think one is, I think learning to just notice a moment. And if it's so, I'm a runner. I love to exercise. I'm a runner and a biker. And what I've noticed over the course of the last couple of years, because I've really worked intentionally on some of what I wrote in the book and what I've seen in other books that I'm reading, is even as a runner who follows a routine and a regiment, there were places that I could fine tune, to push myself to just get a little bit more of a nugget or a morsel out of that and increase the benefit or increase the enjoyment, whatever it is. So I think even those things that we do, well, I would say, especially those things that we often do on autopilot, maybe practice for a day or a week. What is it like to not be on autopilot? What would it be like to ask yourself one probing question? How am I feeling right now? What am I noticing? Why is this what about this is important to me, right? Just the practice of asking yourself good questions can go a long way, and I don't think it matters what situation you're in, to practice that sort of routine.
Yeah, so I think one transition that's probably quite common among a lot of our listeners is that we have folks who either are in or are in the process of pursuing or transitioning into administrator roles in
Yeah.
their schools. And uh, obviously, this is a planned and desired change in
Yeah.
one's career, but yet it is dramatic. It's a completely different set of responsibilities. It's a different skill set. It's something that really is going. It's going to. There's going to be some discomfort once you get there.
Yeah.
I'm wondering in a couple of ways. One, for those who are navigating that transition themselves, what are some of the basics for navigating a change of that nature? Okay, this is something I wanted. I
Hmm.
pursued it. It was part of, however, I'm going to be learning a lot. And then two, once I get there, or maybe I've already been in this role for a while and this is no longer a change for me, but I'm in a role where I am managing a lot of other people. And part of the nature of my job is that I am going to be putting other people into these situations where
Hmm.
they, right? So what do
Yeah.
I need to know about this so that I am equipping them and preparing them and saying, look, here's what's coming.
Hmm.
I have to ask you to do this. But so let's start first with, okay, I'm transitioning myself. I'm going from teacher to administrator. I'm happy. I'm excited.
Hmm.
I'm also a little nervous. What do I have to do?
I think that anyone who is able to articulate what you just did, which is I'm noticing that I'm really excited and I'm also noticing that I'm nervous, you've already started the process, right? Because part of the book is really, again, picking your head up and paying attention to what's going on in your mind, your heart, and your body as you make this transition. And I would say, what I wrote as you were talking, Ross, I wrote down, I hope that everyone is celebrating, right? Because typically you can find something, especially in the transitions that we've selected, you should pause and take time to celebrate. Don't just run, you know, full board into this new transition. The next thing I would do, and this isn't always linear, but one opportunity that you'd have in these new transitions is to re-examine what's a priority for you. And so in sort of the coaching world and in the business world, we call that your core values or your pillar, right? And so examining what's important, and a really easy thing, Ross, that people can do, and we call in coaching, we call it peak experience. And what you ask yourself to do, you take 5 minutes and you sit down in a quiet place and you ask yourself, describe a moment or an experience either in this context or that brought you to this context that you just know this is why you're here. And you write for 5 minutes and then you spend a couple of minutes reflecting on what are you noticing that came out for you, right? And through that process, you can sometimes unearth what's a priority and what's important to you. And if you put a stake, like literally I'm thinking about, going explorer, expeditioner, right? Putting a stake in the place where they are. If you are able to put a stake in those core values, now you have an anchor, because when something isn't going well, why isn't it going well? Is it rubbing up against my core values? What in the system or in myself is getting in the way, right? What do I
Right.
need to do to course correct? And I think that knowing your core values, knowing where you are, is critical to this work.
Yeah, no, I certainly agree with that. And I mean, it's true in, so many situations as well. It's having that anchor, that reference point. That's something
Yep.
that we've talked about in some recent episodes is based on whatever you're working on, whatever your approach is, when in doubt, what do I go back to?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
for some people, it's that question of why, what's the purpose of this
Mm-hmm.
work? And is what
Yep.
we're doing adhering to that, which of course that's going to lead to your core values.
Yep.
For others, it may be different, but it's saying, okay, when I get into that situation where I am in uncharted territory and
Mm-hmm.
I don't know the answer, what do I look at to give me the answer? and
Yeah.
and if you know those values and you typically adhere to them, the answer will become clear.
Yeah.
um
I mean, I will say
mhm,
too, Ross, just to add on to that, your listeners might think, well, Carey, that's such a, of course, that's such an obvious answer. And I would say, yeah, it is an obvious answer. And people, especially leaders, don't always take the time that's required to do that self-examination. And I think to your second point about if you're leading people, what can you do to support people? I think one, you can model that we value giving yourself space for that self-reflection and examination. And two, you as a leader can create that space and
Hmm.
place for your teachers, whomever is reporting to you, to do some of that work. So yes, it is obvious that that's what we should do, but our system and our sort of mindset doesn't always prioritize the time to do the work. So
Right. Yeah. And ultimately, yeah, right, it might seem, I don't know, easier said than done, or
yeah.
even like sort of a cliched response, but it's true. And it is entirely consistent across all areas of our lives where we're in a position where we're presented with untold options and we need to make good choices and take the actions that we think will put us in the direction we want to be in.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, if there were no options, then there would be nothing impressive or requiring skill to navigate them, right?
Yeah.
If you're, I don't know, if you're a 18-year-old in high school and you're at a party and somebody offers you alcohol, um, you make a decision based on probably some predetermined beliefs that you have around what's legal, what's illegal, what you believe is
Mm-hmm.
healthy, more whatever. If nobody ever offers it to you and you didn't have it, then it wouldn't, okay, that's great, but you didn't have to navigate anything. So
Right.
it's kind of like having those tethers. Some of the situations are less black and white than that, and it's internal action, and
Mm-hmm.
it's our own self-reflection,
Yeah.
and yet that's how we prepare for it.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I think about is, you write about normalizing the discomfort,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that that word normalize is kind of, different people take it in different ways, and
Mm-hmm.
sometimes it's more and it's intended to be more of a proactive, inclusive, terminology to say, look, these things that typically were considered either unpleasant, undesirable,
Mm-hmm.
unusual, outside of the mainstream, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they're not. They're in the range of normal experience, and we just
Mm-hmm.
need to understand that. Other people may see it as defeatist in a sense, to say,
Mm.
well, I guess we just, what, we can't get rid of this, so we just have to normalize it. But the way I
Mm.
think about it in this case is, okay, the unanticipated transitions in our lives that are inevitable, they take many shapes and forms, right? One
Mm-hmm.
of the examples is an unexpected job loss,
Mm-hmm.
um, but it could also be an unexpected job gain, right? The recruiter
Mm-hmm.
reaches out to you and offers you a position you never planned for, and it's really great, but it's also
Mm-hmm.
throwing you off because you weren't planning on it. Or joining an organization, or dealing with a pandemic, right? They
Mm-hmm.
they, they come in all shapes and forms. The way I kind of think about it is, if there were none of these things, could we possibly live an interesting life if everything that ever happened to us was exactly what we expected and preordained? I mean, would that be a better alternative? I don't know. I
Yeah. I
think the answer
mean,
is no.
yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think, well, right now I feel competent enough to manage my discomfort. So I would not want to live a life that's not uncomfortable, right? Because then, I mean, like when there's sort of the opposites, they sort of help illuminate the importance of the other, right? So
Mhm,
the light and the dark, sort of as a very simplistic example. I mean, when I say normalize, I think what I'm thinking about too is, and again, the research, you can read lots of research on this, is often the human reaction to something uncomfortable or hard. We think either I'm not doing it right, it's not good, or I'm
mhm,
not good enough, right? We use that feeling of discomfort as some kind of outcome measure. And what
mhm,
I'm trying to help people understand is that what normalizing means, include it in your expectations. When you take a learning journey, whether it's a new job, being a student, retiring for the first time, there's going to be there's going to be ebbs and flows, peaks and
mhm,
valleys, whatever your metaphor is. And I think, and this is true, and I learned this, sometimes the hard way, again, as a runner. One thing I love about trail running is you don't run the requisite distance to make sure you make that distance, you learn to run, to practice, to problem solve.
Mm,
Because as a trail runner, even as a marathoner, if you're out there for 4 to 8 hours, something is going to go wrong. It just
right.
does. And so I think the normalizing is just include it in your expectations. Like we have to get away from this sort of I'm successful if it's perfect, right? And I
Hmm.
think my wanting this normalization is seeing so many students, especially graduate students who come into doctoral studies, and what they're reading are these refined, peer-reviewed, drafted final products of a research paper. And they have no sense initially that between the idea and that published paper was a lot of discomfort. It's part of the
Right.
process. So even the Steve Jobs of the world, the Brene Browns of the world, think of a successful person in your life. They've had bumps and bruises. And I'm
Hmm.
just saying, for me, normalization is it's all part of the mess, right? And we need to
Right.
learn to embrace it.
Yeah, and and one of the things you referenced even in the introduction to the book is the process of guided discovery
Hmm.
that is present in psychological practice, and in that context, going back through things that you've done or been through or navigated in your life and having a new perspective on it and saying, oh, actually I did pretty well there, or
Hmm.
that thing that at the time I wasn't too thrilled about did set me up for this thing that happened later. And
Hmm.
it relates a lot to something that I've been thinking and talking a lot about, which is all aspects of communication that are happening in schools and school districts, and particularly around you know the needs of administrators to better engage their faculty
Mm.
because of what we have recruitment and retention concerns, and cultural school culture concerns, and trying to figure out, okay, what's really happening in the profession and what's happening in our schools. And also, to engage our communities, we need to get a better grasp on all the good things we're doing all the time so that we can communicate that proactively, so that it's not like people only hear about the one bad thing that happens.
Yeah.
And a lot of it is the same, right? Because even by the nature of me coming to you once a week and saying, oh, like, what did you do this week? Or, what were some good things that happened? And giving you the opportunity to talk about it. In the moment, you probably weren't thinking about all those things as achievements. You were probably thinking about, oh, this test yesterday, my kids didn't do as well as I wanted them to, or I had this behavioral issue or whatever.
Hmm.
And then just by talking about, well, this, oh, actually, that was pretty good. It sets us up. I mean, it's kind of, you can be better equipped to normalize and anticipate what's to come ahead by looking backward and saying, oh, that's what it looked like when I already did that over the last few weeks, and that's what it looked like. So if the next few weeks are similar to that, then I can handle that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think what I was thinking as you were also talking, Ross, was what comes up for me, and you see this in the mindfulness literature, is this notion of non-attachment,
Mm,
right? Because what happens, I've seen it personally, and I have kids in school, I see it with our teachers, is teachers, especially during the pandemic, well, anytime, teachers are doing the best they can and they're doing a great job. And for the most part, and parents come in upset one night, right? And if a teacher hasn't done the work or been given the space to do the work around some of the things we're talking about, I mean, the emotions hijack the moment,
mhm,
right? I mean, they really do. You aren't neurologically, I'm not a neuroscience, but from scientist, but I understand that you are not neurologically able to sort of manage that right in that moment in terms of your cognition, because your emotions have hijacked that moment,
mhm,
right? So if you are able to start practicing non-attachment and think about discomfort emerging in these moments, what you might be able to do is show up curious and notice that, oh, Ross is upset. Like, right? It's no longer
mhm.
about me as the teacher of your son or daughter. It's something's going on with Ross and I need to pay particular attention. And now I'm going to ask him another question. makes it a very different situation if you can. It's hard. Like, don't get me wrong, this takes lots and lots of practice, but normalizing that discomfort really can give our teachers, our administrators, our parents agency,
Hmm.
right, to show up and be present and ask better questions instead of being led by our emotions or whatever sort of is in that moment, right?
Right. Yeah. And I mean, you bring up an interesting perspective of the parent who's
Hmm.
coming to the school and who is, you know, navigating all these things in their own life,
Yeah.
and who is, may or may not have the vocabulary to express it. And a lot of times, and what I've been investigating with schools is basically when are the schools making it so that the parent doesn't have that information because we're not
Mm,
communicating enough. We're not telling them what we're doing. We're not, keeping them informed enough about all these things. And so they're feeling all of this anxiety, stress, concern about what may or may not be going on in the school. And I mean, how can, you know, so let's say absent all that, that's this is what's occurring. And I'm working in the
mhm,
school and I'm a teacher or I'm an administrator, and I can tell this is what parents are dealing with. How can I use my awareness of this process to help me kind of navigate that without, I'm not going to lecture to them and tell, well, you need to notice and name and navigate, but to kind
yeah.
of say, all right, let me respond to them in a way
Hmm.
that hopefully helps this move forward. Like, essentially, okay, I've gotten good at doing this for myself, but what do
Yeah.
I do when I can tell somebody else is having a challenge?
Before we move on, let's hear from our sponsors.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think, our learning theorists, our social learning theorists would tell us that, still focusing on how we show up in a space can have an impact on the other people in the room, right? I mean,
Mhm.
Bandura would say that in terms of modeling and things. So
Right.
I think being able to, another question that comes up in coaching in these moments that you describe. So if we have a parent or a caregiver who shows up in this space, something you can sort of quietly ask yourself is, what's 2% true about this moment?
Mhm.
Right? Which means, as hard as it is to hear everything this person is saying because they're so anxious, they're advocating for their kid, they don't have the language to articulate it. What's 2% true? Well, what's probably 2% true if I were thinking about it is, this caregiver loves their child and cares deeply about their education. We have that in common. So maybe
Mhm.
you, as the teacher, the administrator, could reflect back to the parent and say, gosh, I am really seeing how committed you are to your person's education. Let's talk. Right. And so what I have noticed is when you're able to interrupt that sort of upset or rage or whatever it is with a curious noticing or question, sometimes the person just like sits up for a second, like, wait, I thought they were going to defend themselves till the cows come home, but they didn't.
Mhm.
They reflected back, right? So
Right.
it's those. I've been reading James Clear's Atomic Habits,
Mhm.
which, huge bestseller, and he says in the book that it's not the big things that make the changes, it's the very small, everyday, tiny changes in our habits and our
Right.
routines that lead to huge impact. And so, yeah, that noticing.
And it's perhaps those little habits and that practice that you have with welcoming, inviting,
Mhm.
or actually I guess it's the practice that you have with navigating that can make you more open to inviting what will be uncomfortable moments. For example, talking to kids about their school experience, right? And saying, all right, I want to ask them about this, but their answers, they might make me uncomfortable. I might not
That's
like what they
right.
say, right? But I really do want to know, and I
Yeah.
want to be able to do something about it. And on the one hand, I can just kind of try to avoid it, or I can lean
Mhm.
into it and say, okay, I'm ready to, you talk about concepts like non-attached. I'm ready to be able to calmly, you know, accept this, and then understand where they're coming from and then navigate it,
Yeah.
and help them when they're challenged by the same thing. And, circling back to what we talked about with administrators, being in a position where the nature of your job may be that you're going to have to put people in positions where they're going to be dealing with a transition, unexpected, sometimes it's negative. One of the things that comes up a lot, from both the giver and receiver, is like, feedback, which I
Hmm.
think causes extreme discomfort for a lot of people, right?
Yeah.
Some people just don't really want to receive it, period, because they've been preconditioned to not really believe it's valuable, or to see it as punitive in nature,
Yep.
and so maybe I'm receiving feedback that's making me question a lot of things, or put me in a position where I'm really uncertain where I stand. Or maybe I have to give it, and I know that the person who's going to be receiving it has had a bad history with this. I don't want that to continue. I want this to be worthwhile to them. But I also know that there's certain things about this discussion that are going to, it could potentially put them spiraling if I don't approach it correctly, right?
Yeah.
I mean, how does that kind of resonate with you as a kind of a micro moment where these feelings do come into play? And if so, what would you kind of say about approaching that from either side?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much packed in there. So the first thing I picked up on was this idea of the question comes up, should I just avoid this, or can I
Mm,
avoid this? And I'm going to
okay.
tell you quite plainly that you can avoid it. Like,
Hmm.
even if you can avoid it at noon today, it's going to come up in some other form later down the road. So I just wish people would give up on that one, because
Hmm.
these things are going to come up somewhere. So that's the first thing. The second thing I would notice from your question is, you said, how do I show up calmly? I just want to be clear that I don't, for me, the goal is not necessarily to show up calmly, because again, to me, that goes back to smoothing over.
Okay.
To me, the goal is to show up in a way that, again, going back to that non-attachment, you could say to someone, oh my gosh, like, I'm hearing you say that, and it's making me feel so upset because I'm so committed to the education of your student, right? You can be honest with boundaries about how you're feeling. Perhaps you just don't, open up the floodgates, right? We have to
Hmm.
include boundaries. So I want to say that, about the sort of emotion thing. Feedback, you're right. I mean, we have a wonderful superintendent in our district. I had a meeting with him the other day, and what he said about feedback is he is trying to instantiate a practice of feedback all the time,
Hmm.
so that it's not just in those moments where someone's doing poorly, right? So that
Right.
people don't see it as punitive. And so I think while you're working on those sorts of things, the reality is you also have to put out the regular fires of every day, right? This isn't going to change overnight. So I think to answer your question, like, how do you manage that situation where you have to give someone feedback who perhaps isn't gonna take it well? I think this is where in the book I talk about sort of setting the stage and sort of the pre-work that you can do. I think perhaps there's a pre-communication with this person before you actually sit down and talk about the feedback, right? I mean, I think, a leader who has done their own work and is prepared to have these conversations could have a conversation with someone about what the purpose of feedback, what the goal of this feedback is, how you are trying to support the person and share with them areas of opportunity and growth and areas where you're excelling, right? Before you even get in. And I've done this. Like, look, I have reviewed lots and lots of draft dissertations in my life. And sometimes we don't use red pen anymore, but sometimes there's lots of track changes in a document. And I know the student, if I email this document to this student,
Right.
it's just going to put them in a corner rocking back and forth. And so what I do instead of sending the document is I say, can we set up a phone call, a Zoom call, and we talk about what's coming, right? So
Hmm.
you don't have to like land it, the
Right.
feedback right away. You could do some pre-work. And gosh, I have to tell you, Ross, if I had a boss who came to me and wanted to have that kind of conversation, wow, that's that's pretty powerful, I think.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think, I mean, there's those significant things we can do to really authentically show our investment in
Hmm.
the situation, and saying this isn't going to make it easy to receive feedback that you're not, that's not entirely positive. However, it makes it easier for you to know what to do with it, because we're going to remove the ambiguity around my intentions,
Yep.
whether or
Yeah.
not I want you to be successful, whether or not I'm even aware that this is okay. I understand this is probably not going to be a little bit upsetting. However, the
Yeah.
reason I'm doing it is because I am invested in your success and I want you to, but it does take that additional bit of effort,
Hmm.
which starts with being mindful and saying, I care how they receive this and what they're able to do with it. I don't just
Yeah.
care about the backlash I'm going to get,
Yeah.
which then is leads to avoidance, right?
What a I don't know, it would be sort of a revolutionary sort of day of PD, but wouldn't it be cool if a leader of a school building or district said, today for our hour of professional learning, we're going to explore our relationship with feedback.
Hmm.
I'm not going to give you any feedback, but we're going to go through some exercises and activities to explore what feedback means, different ways we give and receive feedback, and explore our relationship. And when I say our relationship, we all have sort of gut reactions
Hmm.
to feedback. We all have emotions that we conjure up. I bet we all have a story. I know I do, of when I got horrible feedback and how I reacted horribly. And that, believe it or not, like that all is part of the package. When you receive today's feedback, that's all in there, right? And so I'm not as a coach, I'm not a therapist. So I'm not here to resolve past issues with feedback. But what I can do is I can work with teachers to help them recognize that maybe some of that emotion isn't actually about this feedback. It's about other things that you've
Right.
experienced from other bosses or supervisors or parents about feedback. So,
Right. Excellent. So is that any part of, I guess, when you're developing a skill set and also a mindset,
mhm.
to be able to navigate these transitions successfully. Does any part of it relate to our individual healthy, I think, conception of our relative sphere of influence? I guess I would say, for example, one of the major transitions you reference as an example is a pandemic, right? Okay.
Mhm.
Well, none of us can control whether or not there's a pandemic. Right?
Yeah.
It's happening, we're living in it, and so we go down a level and a level to we figure out, okay, what are the things that we can influence or control? Why am I feeling a certain way about how things are happening there?
Mhm.
What is going on? And then what might I want to do about it? Yeah, I just kind of am thinking, like, because so much of it is obviously, a lot of us, if we're suffering from um, you know anxiety that leads to essentially paralysis of taking action, is we're hung up on things that we can't do anything about.
Mhm.
And if we're kind of perseverating on that, that's never going to change, or it
Mhm.
might change, but it won't change due to anything that we did. But then if we go down a couple more levels, it's like, okay, well, here's what I can do, and here's okay. And I mean, I don't know if that's a context that you ever typically present this in, or that
Mhm.
people are thinking through as they're figuring out, okay, how do I basically get myself in the right mindset
Mm.
to approach this, because if I'm kind of focused on the wrong things, it's just really hard to get there.
Yeah, it is. And I think not only are we focused on the wrong things, but especially with your example of a pandemic, this is a place as a world we had never been before.
Mm,
Because in other situations, at least, we had sort of, examples of what the outcome was, right? For in this one, we didn't know. And so I guess if I were giving, a talk or sharing this with a group of individuals, I would say that it's really important to think about being curious and adopting a learning mindset in the moment, right? Just staying curious. And with that, I mean, seeing every opportunity as an opportunity to learn that perhaps you're not going to know. There is going to be uncertainty. And this is where that discomfort comes back, right? Because like uncertainty also creates discomfort. And so I would say being able to explore that. The other thing I would say, and we started our conversation off with this, Ross, is go back to your core values, right? Go back to your priorities and what's important. And maybe during the pandemic, if you did that sort of peak experience, or one of the many hundred ways you can mine for core values, maybe you're noticing that your core values have shifted a little bit. And that's okay. You add, you subtract, they change over time. If you go back to your core values, then you can start asking your questions like, if before the pandemic you used to meet your friends at a coffee shop every Monday and you're just desperate for that, ask yourself, what was it about that experience that was important? Was it being physically in that coffee shop? Probably not. It was conversation, connection, being in the know about your friends, building relationships. So once you know that, then you can start to say, what are the ways that I could find that in other things that I do? Right. So by doing that sort of work, Ross, it helps you to focus away from the problem that you cannot solve to a challenge that perhaps you can solve, you can address. And the cool thing is, if you show up curious, you may solve it in ways you never imagined were possible. They weren't even on your short list. I mean, who knew that Zoom was going to be, everywhere, right? In 2 years, or who knew that remote work was going to be something that just became, of course you can work remotely, right? So those are simple examples, but it really allows you to sort of be creative about what those possibilities might be to reach what's important, the priorities that you have in those experiences.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And so, as a reminder to our listeners, the book is called Dancing with Discomfort, a framework for noticing, naming, and navigating our in-between moments. And I want to give you that reminder because we have those 3 phases, right? Notice, name, navigate. I'm wondering, is there a particular point in there where you've observed the most common obstacle as somebody is working through there? Is it at the beginning? Some people would think, okay, well, obviously the 3rd step is the hardest, but not necessarily. But I'm wondering, okay, if I'm newly approaching this and I'm thinking about how I'm going to go about it, where might I expect that this part might be extra difficult?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the easy answer, Ross, is it's going to be different for different people, right? Because different people have tolerances for uncertainty and things. So that's the first thing I will say. I would suggest that the navigate part feels the least difficult to people because it's like doing. It's like it feels tangible. We know what navigate is. There's some places in the book that are very clear about strategies. And if you're a teacher, that's like thinking about pedagogy and strategy and connection, right? Like that feels familiar. I honestly think if you're new to this kind of mindset, the noticing and naming is the hardest part, because it goes back to what we talked about before with core values. Is someone might say, of course, you should know what your values, your priorities, your pillars, whatever you want to call them, are. But following the of course is, I don't really know how to do that work. Right. And so I spend a lot of time with new coaching clients, just easing them into noticing. I know that sounds so silly, but just that, instantiating or routinizing the habit of noticing takes practice. And it's again, it's that cumulative work of doing it. I never ask a client if we settle on some accountability in the session. I never ask a client to try something for a week or a month. I say, let's try it for a day. Let's try it for the afternoon. And then check in with yourself, see what worked, what didn't, and then tweak it. Right. You have to set small, manageable goals for yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, one of the things that I don't know, is it possible to maybe set checkpoints for
Mm-hmm.
yourself to say, I mean, if I think about it in my own recent life here, it was about 7 months ago that I decided to leave a full-time position and start my own company. And what I did at the time was say, all right, 6 months out is my checkpoint. There's some
Mm,
things I have enough information to say that I believe I know how things will go to a certain extent. There's a lot of other things I have no idea of. And basically, at 6 months, I will look back and reflect and say what's working, what's not, what's good,
yeah.
and then it would make the next phase that much easier. And it's not about winning or losing. So
Mm-mm.
much of what we do is evaluated in those terms.
Yeah.
And ultimately, I think of a lot of the relationship between this framework and the mindset for this framework and Carol Dweck's work on growth mindset, and how we really do have to work through some challenges to have a better understanding of our strengths and know and to be able to dispense with the imposter syndrome
Yep.
and understand that I actually do know how to do these things because I
Mm-hmm.
did the hard work and I navigated it and I thought about it and I reflected on it.
Yeah.
So if we're never challenged on that, that's when we say, oh, maybe I don't know as much as I thought I did because everything kind of came easily. I don't know if for certain folks who are saying, okay, I'm willingly going into something that's going to be challenging. I don't know how it's going to go. Set, set a point a little ways down the road, and say, I'm not going to stress about how I did until I get there.
Yeah. Yeah. I think having waypoints or markers or checkpoints are all important.
Mhm.
And I think depending on, again, what your priorities are and what your needs are, that will sort of, form some of those checkpoints. I would say at a more granular level, I would encourage individuals or groups who want to take on some of this work to think very simply, right? Like you can have big goals, whether it's financial or going up the corporate ladder, whatever is, of course, you should have those sorts of goals. But it's not about, it's an and, yes. And I think that perhaps other considerations would be, for example, what's the sort of aspirational identity that you're trying to integrate into your current identity? So, for example, if I want to be a writer, right? Like I wanted to write a book. I told you at the beginning, it was a bucket list. So I had to
Mhm.
start thinking about, well, what is it? What is an identity of a writer? What are the habits of a writer? Well, writers probably write a little bit every day. So I wanted to start replicating that and creating that habit. So perhaps for a district leader, you want he or she or they to be thinking about what's the kind of identity that I want to bring to this role? And then what are the associated habits? And if you start to do that, then you can start to say, just like you would for running or learning an instrument or whatever it is, I'm going to do this a little bit every day.
Mhm.
And then I'm going to add another habit a little bit in that day. And then by that checkpoint, you probably can sort of look at what are the habits that I've adopted? Why haven't I been able to adopt that one habit I thought was important? What's getting in my way? Right. So then it leads to other questions and curiosities about how maybe I decided that wasn't a habit in that identity, or maybe I decided that it wasn't important to what I'm trying to achieve, or gosh, maybe it is important and I need to adjust this way. Right. So I think you can have large the sort of traditional checkpoint goals. And I think you could have, the little steps that you're going to take on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, and then as we kind of wrap up here, and I would also, illustrate that I think that the eventual outcome, one, there's no, it's all subjective, but it's also whether you won, lost, whatever, is not necessarily correlated to how you have been able to navigate these. I would say, I mean, maybe, I don't know how you feel about my theory, but I would think that after their first bout, even though Rocky lost, that I don't think I don't think he was suffering from imposter syndrome, but Apollo probably was, because it was a little easy for him up to that point, and he didn't expect it to go that way. But Rocky had already leaned into an uncomfortable situation. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I think I agree. I'm a big Rocky fan too, by the way. I mean, I think your point is well taken also, and I would add that sometimes those long-term goals can actually get in our way too, right? Because like if you're so hyper focused on this one thing and then it doesn't work out,
Hmm.
well, then you're completely blocked and can't even move forward. So by focusing on the sort of next the next match, the next boxing match versus being the champion of the world, who knows what's possible? Maybe being champion of the world doesn't end up being the outcome, but it's something again that you hadn't even imagined was possible, right?
Right.
And so that's the point is, and again, part of the mindset of this work is being present, right? Being present in the moment, not 5 years from now or 3 years from now, but like taking as much from this moment as you can and let's see what happens. What's
Yeah.
possible.
Excellent. Well, Carey, thanks for being with us. Where can our listeners learn more about you, your work, your podcast?
Yeah, so I have a website. It's tellmethis.com. There you can find information about my work as a coach and the podcast. There's a link to the podcast. And the podcast is called Tell Me This, and it's on all the regular, Spotify, Apple and stuff. So yeah,
Excellent. Well, we thank Dr. Carey Borkoski for being here on the Authority Podcast, and we're going to put the information in the show notes about her book, Dancing with Discomfort, where to find it. You can get it from John Cat Educational. You can get it through other channels where books are sold, and her website and her other work as well. And make sure you subscribe to the Authority if you want more in-depth author interviews such as these, including interviews that Jethro will conduct and other folks across our network. And visit our website, thepodcast.network, to learn more about all of our shows.
cool. Thank you, Ross. It's been a pleasure.
Do you want to simplify your school's technology, save teachers time, and improve students' performance on state assessments? You can do it all, but don't waste another minute. Head straight to ixl.com/BE to learn how IXL's research-proven teaching and learning platform can help you achieve all of these goals. That's ixl.com/BE.